Foreign interference is once again front and center in Canada, and we're now going to be joined by our news director, David Clement, who's joining us from Ottawa. David, why is the reaction to McGuinty's comments about interference in the media?
So the mood right now in Ottawa is pretty concerning or concerned. We're talking about some significant, potentially some significant interference on behalf of China and India in the Canadian media sphere. And it's important to note that this can really take a couple different forms. So one of the instances that's being alleged is buying media space without attributing to attribution. And the key here is that Canadian newspapers, for example, had long-run inserts paid for by Chinese state media, and that was not considered interference at the time because they were always properly attributed to whatever the original source was or whomever was paying for that placement. This would go one step beyond that, where we would have coverage essentially done in a certain way without disclosing that relationship to its original source. Now, on the other hand, you can also have a foreign country essentially try and strong-arm its nationals within Canada. And so we have seen that in numerous instances where they target diaspora communities and they attempt by various means, whether by threat or coercion or reward, to influence certain outcomes. And so we don't know too much about that particular allegation, but that is what the consensus here is that it's likely a combination of the two.
And why exactly is the problem growing?
What we're seeing right now in Ottawa is part of the reason why it's growing is that Canada still matters on the world stage. We may be a relatively small country population-wise, but we fight above our weight class economically. And so outcomes in Canada, Canada's position on certain things at the world stage still matters. And so that is one of the driving factors in terms of why we're seeing interference in politics, interference in the media. The other kind of aspect here is that the media industry, generally speaking, has been struggling. And so if there are instances where articles are published and paid for and they're not attributing that to its original source, it could be a matter of looking for where funds are available, and this could be a source of funds.
For the report that potentially implicated elected officials, can you give us the lay of the land of what is next?
Yeah, so what's next here is it looks like the accusations are going to be shifted into the foreign interference inquiry. That likely leaves a lot more questions as opposed to answers in terms of what actually happens next and what that process entails. And certainly for a lot of people who've been wanting to know who the people are who are implicated, it certainly doesn't get us closer to an instance where we know who's been accused.
And what have been the reactions to Elizabeth May's comments on that report?
So I think the reaction was one part relief because she insinuated that no members of parliament were implicated. And it's important to note here that she read the unredacted report. She's sworn to secrecy, so her word choice is going to be very specific, very particular. And so she spoke with intent when she said that, without breaking any of the rules in which she's sworn by. But a lot of questions here in Ottawa right now are a lack of conversation about the Canadian Senate. She didn't talk about the Canadian Senate. And some people are maybe reading between the lines and wondering if the officials who are implicated are folks who are in the Senate. And so that's one of the big questions here in Ottawa right now is do Elizabeth May's comments imply that maybe the report is actually disclosing that it's members of the Senate who have either wittingly or unwittingly cooperated with a foreign power.
And what is being proposed to fix this?
Well, we have the foreign agent registry being debated right now. We don't know where that's going to go as of yet, but that is one of the proposals.
The federal government says if it doesn't make a key change to the Citizenship Act in response to a court ruling from last year, the immigration minister himself will have to take on a larger workload.
Well, if it doesn't come through, we're sort of in no man's land. Basically, it's my discretion deciding who's Canadian or not. Obviously, that shouldn't be up to the discretion of a minister. There needs to be a framework in which these lost Canadians that are entitled to be Canadians and had their identity, citizenship taken away from them by the previous government are entitled to become Canadians again. So ideally that law would go through. Courts typically have been deferential to the parliamentary process, but obviously it's their discretion and their jurisdiction to state something. So we will put our best foot forward and hope for the best. But what we don't want to find ourselves in is really in a no man's land.
Yeah, is there any sort of penalties or anything for missing that deadline?
I mean, the reality is the court's judgment, as comprehensive as it was, leaves an open space to interpretation as to who is entitled to that, and not everyone is entitled to be Canadian. There should be some criteria that we put forward, and I think that's properly contained in the bill that we set forth.
The government has until June 19th to correct issues with the Act, as ordered by the Ontario Superior Court, which found that Canadians born abroad received a lower class of citizenship than those born in Canada. Still with us from Ottawa is our news director, David Clement. David, what exactly happens if Ottawa can't reach the deadline on time?
Yeah, like the minister alluded to, we are in no man's land, and what happens essentially is his office has discretion over who isn't Canadian. And really why that's a problem is it goes against, as the minister alluded to, it goes against the rules-based order that Canadian democracy is supposed to be built on. We traditionally don't put that type of power and discretion into the hands of any minister. Usually in the way in which Canadian democracy works, we have rules that are made by government and bureaucrats who then implement those rules. And so this kind of takes that out of the equation and leaves a lot of room for debate and discussion. And that's part of the reason why Ottawa's having a hard time pushing through any type of bill that would put this issue to bed.
Now, can you walk us through what the major sticking points are in terms of getting a bill passed?
Yeah, so right now there seems to be a big debate on what qualifies as having a connection to Canada. So you have to understand that for Canadians born abroad, it depends on how far that extends. And so you could have Canadian citizens who have a child abroad. That child grows up to become an adult. They never necessarily live in Canada or work in Canada, but they have Canadian citizenship, and then they have a child abroad. Does that child become Canadian by virtue of the court ruling? And so the big sticking point here is the language is they have to have a connection to Canada, but there are a lot of questions about what connection to Canada means. Does it mean lived here? And if so, for how long? Does it mean worked here? And so those are some of the big issues right now in terms of who and how we decide fits into this new provision by virtue of the court ruling in Ontario.
And how does this debate play into the larger discussion Canada is having about immigration?
That one is really, I think, where the crux of the debate is, because nationally the mood, if you look at the recent polls, has somewhat turned or soured in regards to immigration. We see a lot of conversation about immigration and its link to the housing crisis and various other issues. There are a lot of questions about whether we can absorb this many migrants all at once with what we're currently doing. Now, it's important to note that granting citizenship to folks who were born abroad doesn't necessarily mean they end up living in Canada. That part of the debate, I think, has been missed in these discussions on Parliament Hill. But another big question is exactly how many potential new Canadians are we talking about? And that really comes down to my previous comment about connection to Canada. However we define that will determine how many potentially new Canadians we're talking about. And that is really one of the big conversations here in Ottawa right now is there any way to really know how many children born abroad to Canadians there are?
David, thank you so much.
Thank you.